So having said all that about presenting the true self to greet all experiences at the door. So what greets experience at the door is the true self, the transparent self, the open self, the welcome self, the loving self, the celebrating self. The one more um, aspect that needs to be part of this welcoming and this celebration is also our own self, the separate ourself. That separate self also needs to be part of that envelope of love and lovingness. And if the negative trigger is to an extent where the separate self, the physical self, is experiencing physical damage or emotional damage or mental damage, which is not consistent with the qualities of lovingness and openness, then the separate self needs to include this aspect also of itself. There's the world and the triggers, and which ultimately is all part of the true self, but it cannot be at the cost or ignoring of the separate self also. That separate self needs to be included in the envelope of compassion. So now, looking at it from the point of view of the separate self, if life is greeted more and more with the transparent, open, true self, then that separate self is free to respond spontaneously to whatever shows up at the door. And that spontaneous response includes extreme negative triggers, which, let's say, in the form of physical abuse or verbal abuse. Then it is okay for that separate self to now respond in ways that are appropriate to that trigger, whether it is, and again, passing through the medium of the true self. So the response need not be one of anger or hate, but simply one of expressing that this is not acceptable, that is inappropriate, and that can be in the form of physically stopping that physical assault or abuse, or exiting the physical space so that you're not directly touched by it. And it can even go to the extent of physically hitting back, but again, not as a not out of anger or hatred, but still again out of simply what is. You're simply still reacting to what is and what is appropriate to what is. So it is still within the envelope of the true self. That response is also still within the envelope of true self. And in fact, when we don't understand this is when the separate self ends up perpetuating that violence or that abuse. So if you think of all the situations where people tolerate or remain in a environment of abuse, even though when they actually do have the choice to leave, it is because of the absence of the true self being, it's that you're still operating out of craving and aversion. And even in the midst of abuse, you're craving love from that same person, and it's sitting there in the hope that one day these blows are going to stop and the person is going to actually love you, uh, and be a positive trigger for you. So it's again, so it is in fact this absence of true self, or the forgetting or the veiling of true self, or the forgetting. There's never an absence, it's actually just a forgetting of the true self. When you forget the true self, you are still operating out of craving and aversion, and therefore, contrary to what we think, that maybe by being so transparent you're going to be a victim of abuse, the opposite is true, that you continue to be a victim of abuse because you have forgotten who you really are. So the paradoxical thought is, you think that if I really operate out of who I am, people are going to trample all over me and I'll be a victim of abuse. Whereas the truth is the opposite, that because you have forgotten who you really are is why you allow such inappropriate actions and events to take place in your life, and you perpetuate them and allow them to continue, because you're still sitting in that hope and that, that contracted self uh, mechanism of craving and aversion. And you may feel aversion to that abuse, and you may feel craving for the opposite of it, but both of those actually keep you stuck in that victim spot and perpetuate that violence and abuse. So by presencing the true self, you are now free to respond in a way that is appropriate to that, which, as we said earlier, is either stopping them, leaving the leaving that physical space if that's possible, or even hitting back if that's what is needed. So this is not about becoming doormats. So what we are talking about presenting at the door is not a doormat that anyone can walk over. It's not that. It's the presence of the powerful, true, loving, accepting, divine, infinitely powerful, infinitely loving self. That's what we present at the door, not a doormat that come and do whatever you want and whatever you can, and be victims of abuse. So it's not about that. So a very important point to make that distinction between presenting self and presenting a doormat. We are not talking about a doormat where anyone can walk over. It's not that. Great.
Good, very nice. Could you please send it right away?